Imagine witnessing this moment firsthand. The tension, the silence, the split second that changed everything. What would you have done if you were there? Do you think the Royal Guard's reaction was the ultimate display of discipline? Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from? And what's your take on this shocking encounter? Your perspective matters. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tomorrow, at this exact time, we're dropping another unbelievable story that you won't want to miss. See you then. He held a broken bottle to a royal guard's throat. What happened next shocked everyone. The late autumn wind swept through Buckingham Palace's grand courtyard, carrying the sharp scent of stale cigarettes and cheap beer. The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone pavement as tourists gathered near the Golden Gates, snapping photos and admiring the grandeur of British tradition. The hum of conversation filled the air until he arrived. Matthew Mad Dog Carter, a 46-year-old ex-convict from New York, moved through the crowd with a predatory confidence. His 6'1" frame, wrapped in a worn-out leather jacket covered in crude patches and metal studs, gave him an intimidating presence. His scarred knuckles, tattoos creeping up his neck, and cold, calculating eyes made it clear. He was looking for trouble. As he walked, people instinctively stepped aside. Two elderly women clutched their handbags tighter, their wary eyes following him. A young father quickly pulled his children closer, sensing the kind of danger that doesn't need to be announced. A few feet away, a retired Marine visiting from Texas watched with quiet suspicion, his military instincts recognizing a man ready to pick a fight. Matthew's boots scuffed loudly against the cobblestones as he stopped near the imposing figure of Sergeant Jack Collins, a 33-year-old Royal Guard standing at perfect attention. His red tunic was crisp, brass buttons gleaming in the sunlight, and his tall black bearskin hat cast a shadow over his eyes. His stance was unshaken, unbothered, a symbol of discipline. Matthew sneered. Look at this guy, standing there like some kind of statue. What's the point of all this? His thick Brooklyn accent cut through the chatter, drawing the attention of nearby tourists. He took a step closer, his beer-soaked breath fogging up the guard's uniform. What do you think, huh? He taunted. You really think this makes you special? Sergeant Collins didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the man in front of him. Matthew chuckled under his breath. All dressed up like a toy soldier. I bet you wouldn't even flinch if I shoved you. The crowd grew quieter. Tourists exchanged uneasy glances. A woman grabbed her partner's arm, whispering, "We should get help." A few feet away, an off-duty NYPD officer discreetly reached for his phone, sensing what was about to unfold. Matthew grinned, stepping even closer, his broad shoulders towering over the still, silent guard. He was here to prove a point, and he wasn't finished yet. The air grew thick with tension. The once lively chatter of tourists had faded into nervous whispers as Matthew Mad Dog Carter loomed over Sergeant Jack Collins. His scarred knuckles clenched and unclenched, a habit born from years of street fights and prison brawls. The 6'1" ex-con was hungry for conflict, and he wasn't leaving until he got a reaction. Nothing to say, huh? Matthew sneered, his gravelly Brooklyn accent cutting through the silence. Just gonna stand there and pretend you're better than the rest of us? He circled the guard, his boots grinding against the cobblestones, every step calculated. The tension in the crowd grew unbearable. A group of high school students on a class trip clung to their teacher, their excitement now replaced with unease. A British veteran in his 70s, wearing a military pin, watched carefully, his jaw tightening. Then, without warning, the impact was hard, a full-force push right into the Royal Guard's chest. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. The tourists braced for an explosion, expecting the guard to lash out, to break formation, to do something. But he didn't. Sergeant Jack Collins stood firm. Not a flinch, not a step back, not even a blink. Matthew's face twisted with frustration. He had spent years fighting men twice his size, breaking people down with his fists. But this was worse. It was like hitting a brick wall, a wall that refused to acknowledge him. You think you're tough, huh? Matthew growled, his voice low and dangerous. His fingers twitched, his mind racing for the next move. He needed control. He needed power. Then, his eyes landed on a glass soda bottle in a nearby tourist's hand. The woman barely had time to react before Matthew snatched it from her grasp. The crowd erupted in protest. "Hey, give that back!" someone yelled. But Matthew didn't care. With one swift motion, he swung the bottle downward. Smash! Glass shattered against the stone pavement, shards flying in every direction. Now gripping the jagged edge, Matthew turned back to the guard. His breath came slow and heavy. His eyes gleamed with something dark. "Let's see how tough you really are, soldier boy." Then he pressed the sharp glass against Sergeant Collins's throat. The crowd froze. No one moved. No one spoke. And Matthew? He started counting. 1, 2. The crowd held its breath. Matthew Mad Dog Carter's hand trembled slightly, gripping the jagged edge of the broken glass bottle. His knuckles were white, his breathing slow and controlled. But there was a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation. The crowd stood frozen, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. A woman in the front clutched her chest. A father instinctively pulled his son behind him. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." But the Royal Guard? Sergeant Jack Collins remained still. The sharp glass pressed against his throat, but his expression never changed. His breathing remained steady. His gaze stayed locked straight ahead. He was unshaken. Matthew gritted his teeth. This was supposed to be easy. Intimidation always worked. But this was different. "You scared, soldier boy?" Matthew taunted, his voice a dangerous growl. No reaction. He tightened his grip on the bottle, pressing the glass just enough to break skin. A thin red line appeared on the guard's neck. Still, nothing. The tension was unbearable. A group of security officers pushed through the crowd, moving fast. A retired Marine in the back of the crowd clenched his fists, ready to step in. The off-duty NYPD officer gripped his radio, already signaling for backup. But before any of them could reach him, the guard moved. It was instantaneous. His white-gloved hand snapped up like lightning, clamping down on Matthew's wrist. In a single fluid motion, he twisted the thug's arm into a perfect joint lock. The glass bottle tumbled from Matthew's fingers, shattering on the stone pavement. Before he could react, before he could even understand what had happened, Sergeant Collins took control. With flawless precision, he yanked Matthew forward, spinning him onto his knees. The ex-convict, the man who had spent years fighting in prison yards, breaking down weaker men, was now completely overpowered. His face twisted in pain, his breathing ragged. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The guard, calm, composed, still disciplined, held Matthew in place, unshaken, unbothered. For the first time, Matthew wasn't the one in control, and he knew it. Matthew Mad Dog Carter had spent his life fighting, on the streets, in prison. He had always been the one in control, the one who decided how a fight would go. But now, he was on his knees, his wrist twisted into an iron grip. His breath came in sharp bursts, his muscles locked with tension. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to thrash, to break free, but he couldn't. Sergeant Jack Collins stood over him, unmoved, unshaken. His grip was firm, but calm, controlled. His red tunic still crisp, his black boots planted with precision. He wasn't shaking with rage, wasn't gloating. He was simply doing what he had been trained to do. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. Phones were held high, recording every second of what had just happened. Security officers rushed in. 2 uniformed men stormed forward, moving fast, their hands on their belts, ready to take over. "Stay down, sir," one of them commanded as he grabbed Matthew's other arm, securing him in place. But Matthew barely heard him. His head buzzed, a mixture of humiliation and disbelief. This was supposed to be his moment, his show of power. He had wanted to prove something, to humiliate the Royal Guard, to tear down the illusion of strength. Instead, he was the one on display. The NYPD officer who had been on standby lowered his radio. He didn't need to call for backup anymore. The situation had already been handled. The retired Marine in the crowd? He crossed his arms, nodding with approval. "That's real discipline right there," he muttered to no one in particular. Matthew gritted his teeth. His own body had betrayed him. He had been beaten without a single punch being thrown. No shouting, no struggle, just pure, undeniable skill. Let him go, one of the security officers said to the guard. With perfect control, Sergeant Collins released Matthew's wrist and stepped back into position. Just like that. Back to duty, back to stillness, like nothing had ever happened. But everyone watching, they would never forget. The moment Sergeant Jack Collins let go, Matthew Mad Dog Carter collapsed onto the cobblestones. His wrists throbbed, his pride shattered. He had spent his life being the predator, the one people feared. But now, he was the one on his knees. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Tourists who had once dismissed the royal guards as mere statues in uniform now looked at them with a newfound respect. Two palace security officers grabbed Matthew's arms, yanking him to his feet. He tried to pull away, but there was no fight left in him. "You're done here, mate," one of the officers muttered as he locked a firm grip around Matthew's wrist. The humiliation burned. His face twisted with frustration, his breath coming out in short, ragged bursts. He had lost. And worse, he had lost without the guard even breaking a sweat. The NYPD officer who had been watching from the crowd took a step forward, arms crossed. "That was over before it even started," he muttered, shaking his head. A few feet away, the retired Marine smirked. He had seen trained warriors in action before, and this was flawless. Sergeant Jack Collins, now back in formation, stood motionless once again. His red tunic, still crisp, his black boots still polished. His expression, unreadable. He had neutralized a threat, restored order, and gone right back to doing his job. No victory dance, no gloating. That was real power. A murmur swept through the crowd. A few claps, a quiet wave of respect. One by one, tourists lowered their phones, whispering amongst themselves. A woman turned to her husband, shaking her head. "I thought they were just for show," she muttered, still stunned. The man nodded slowly. Not anymore. Matthew Carter, now restrained by security, lowered his head. He had come here to prove a point. Instead, he had become the lesson. The officers led him away, his boots scraping against the pavement, his defeat now permanently recorded in the minds and cameras of everyone around him. As the sun began to set, Buckingham Palace stood as it always had, unshaken, untouched. And at its gate, the royal guard remained, silent and unmoved, as the world around him finally understood why. What just happened here was more than just a moment. It was a lesson in discipline, control, and true strength. What would you have done if you were there? Do you think the royal guard's response was the ultimate show of restraint, or should he have acted sooner? Let's hear your thoughts. Would you have stepped in, or do you believe the guard handled it perfectly? Tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and how do you feel about what just happened? This wasn't just about a man pushing his limits. It was about a battle between arrogance and discipline. A fight between a man who thought strength came from fear and a soldier who showed that real power lies in composure. Did this story change how you see the royal guards? Have you ever witnessed something similar? Drop a comment and let us know your perspective. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tomorrow, at this exact time, we're bringing you another jaw-dropping story you won't believe. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.